Dark Academia books are some of my favourite books and I want to reread all of them. But hello my loves, and thank you for joining me. It's Kirsten, and today we are looking into Dark Academia, what it is and the books I'd recommend for it. So what is Dark Academia? Well, if you look on Pinterest, then you're going to get a lot of this. It's an aesthetic now. It's an obsession with learning in a romanticized way. And all of the images, if you look on Pinterest, have a very similar theme. The fashion aesthetic of it is amazing. I love it. But it's more than that. It's now seeping into the books that we read. So let's have a look at where it all kind of started. For me, the original Dark Academia book is actually Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It has all the things that I think a Dark Academia book has, all the hallmarks for it. Obsession with a particular subject, and that obsession leads to our main character, who is an unreliable narrator anyway, making very questionable moral decisions, ending up blurring the line between what is morally acceptable and what is not because of their obsession with the particular topic. And normally murder gets involved. And I think Frankenstein hits all of those. So Victor Frankenstein becomes obsessed with science and how it can interact with life and death and overcoming death, and that is his goal. It then leads him to create his monster, which is an act of hubris in of itself, questioning those morals that we have of what is right and wrong, and it leads down a very dark path where lots of murder happens. It is so good and so compelling, and I do think it is the original Dark Academia book. We will be talking about other classics as we get further into this, but I'm looking at more what is the core of Dark Academia, and I do think Frankenstein ticks all of those boxes. That being said, the book that actually gets credited with being the starter of Dark Academia and the resulting obsession, which has definitely grown, I would say lately, as in the last few years, it has just skyrocketed with the amount. Like if you look on TikTok or things like that, there are so many different videos for Dark Academia books, Dark Academia aesthetic, how you decorate your living area to how you dress. It is a massive, almost like cult-like thing at the minute. But the book that kind of started it all off and gets the credit for it is Donna Tartt's The Secret History. And to me it is quintessentially Dark Academia. We have our unreliable narrator. We're being told the tale of what has happened from one of the characters that gets caught up in this obsession of a particular subject. So we're following our main character who attends this prestigious school, wants to get involved in the classics. It's very elite, very closed off. The teacher himself is very eccentric and will only allow certain people in, and they don't talk about it outside of class. They keep very much to themselves, and eventually our main character gets caught up in all of that, and you see the obsession that the students have with the classic. Again, it leads them down a darker path. There is murder involved, there is a lot of things, questionable things, all because of their obsession with the classic. It is an amazing book. I will admit, actually, the first time I read this book, I am due a reread. The second half of the book didn't grip me as much. The first half, perfection, had everything to do with it, had the darker atmosphere to it, we had the unreliable narrator, we saw the growing obsession with the particular topic and seeing how our main character just gets tangled up more and more, and eventually there's no way out, and you see how far they've actually come from where they started. But the end of the book, like the second part of this book, was very kind of drawn out. I found that once the climax had happened, it was then just dragging out the rest of the story. Since then, I've read a lot of Dark Academia books, so I feel like this would change upon reread for me. But it is the one that gets all the acclaims for starting the Dark Academia genre, even though I do think Frankenstein fits in that perfectly, and obviously this came out way beforehand. It does show where this all started, and this was done in 1993, I believe. 1993, the year I was born. So yeah, it's a fantastic book, and it is seen as the mother of Dark Academia subgenre. that has come about. Another book that gets paired with The Secret History a lot is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This, I have to admit, I prefer to Secret History. It's such a fantastic book. I loved it. I've annotated this one. It is stunning. And we have that same obsession. So again, we have the same kind of tick boxes that I would expect from a dark academia book. First of all, we have the obsession with a subject. This time it's with Shakespeare. We are following a main character who again is our unreliable narrator, so another tick, who goes to this school. It's an elite school, so again another tick there, where we have them all being actors, but the only thing that they act is Shakespeare. So they are entrenched in it and they are in their final year, and you have a lot of them that are throwing Shakespeare quotes back and forth. That's the way they sometimes talk to one another. Some people don't like that because they say it's not realistic. I think if you are entrenched in something and this is what you are living and breathing for years, yeah, you would. Because it gives you a better understanding of the context of what you are learning and studying. You really want to pass, you really want to do this, so of course it is going to become your life. And so I think it's actually very valid that they do that, and I think it worked really well. But of course we have the obsession that then leads to some of Shakespeare's tragedies being more brought to life than what they should. Fantastic, it is so well done. We have the murder, so another tick. We have the morally grey, questionable decisions going on. It is so fantastic. And another thing that I tend to find with dark academia books, especially for like the core ones as I see them, is we have our narrator that's telling us the tale, telling us after it's happened. So in this one, we have our main character that is talking to a police officer. You're seeing their side of events, what's happened. As a result, they are an unreliable narrator. So everything you read, you have to kind of question, like, did it really happen like this? Are you just painting yourself in a particular light? Like, how does this all work? I loved it though. It was absolutely fantastic. So these two books are the two books you're going to see in pretty much every dark academia video because they are seen as the pillars of dark academia. A lot of people do say that If We Were Villains is just like a copycat of The Secret History, and yes, in a way, but then isn't every dark academia book a copycat of these in some way, because that's what the genre is. We just have one obsessed about classics, one obsessed about Shakespeare, and you will see the common theme of different obsessions as we go through. These are the two pillars of dark academia, although like I say, I do think Frankenstein should be in there as well. And then we kind of move on. So we kind of get books that are core, so all of those different things. I think there is a very finite amount of those that actually for me are core dark academia books, and then we kind of have offshoots. So for me, we have aesthetic dark academia books, which we will get into, weird dark academia books which don't quite fit in fully with the core, books that aren't seen as dark academia but do have elements, so it could be argued, and we have ones that are seen as dark academia but I would say are more ad hoc dark academia. So we're going to get into all of those and explore it fully, but of course we had to start off the video with talking about the three main pillars of what dark academia actually is. So another book that I think could be classed as a core dark academia book is actually The Furies by Katie Lowe. So again, we have this tight-knit group of young girls that become enamored with their professor, who seems a little bit more unique than others, and we have a main character that gets caught up with this group, and again we have murder and things ensue. It's been a few years since I've read this. This was actually probably my first dark academia book that I've read, and I didn't fully get behind it. There is a lot of bullying aspects in this, and I don't really like bullying in books, so it did kind of taint it for me, but I've kept hold of it because every time I think about it, I'm like, no, I need to reread this book because I feel like there are so many elements within this book that would work perfectly, and it may not be as obsessed about like classics or Shakespeare or something like that, but there is that obsession and kind of witchcraft element to this book that I think gives it that core dark academia book for me. And again, we're seeing it from one narrator, again after everything that's happened, so it's a bit more unreliable as well, and we do have some murders. I feel like the murders could have been developed a little bit more in this book, but yeah, I think it's very good, but this one is seen as more of a witchcraft obsession rather than an obsession over a particular subject like the classics. But I still think it works as a core dark academia book, so I would recommend this one if you haven't read it. It's not one that I see many people talk about when they talk about dark academia. I feel like it had hype when it first came out and then it's kind of died down, but I do think it is worth picking up. A book that I never know where to place, but I feel like is definitely more core dark academia compared to some of the other ones that I will be talking about, and that is These Violent Delights by Micah Nemereva. This is a tale of obsession with these two boys. One of them has an obsession. It's not over a particular subject, but it is over preserving beautiful things like butterflies. The obsession and darker side of himself that comes out because he then becomes obsessed with this other person who is incredibly smart. So I feel like, does it actually go with the core? Maybe not, because it doesn't have a set obsession over a subject, but obsession is drenched throughout this book. And again, we have the unreliable narrator because we're seeing this from one of the guy's perspectives and we're seeing his version through his eyes, and so it is unreliable because you can't trust what he's saying. He ends up being such a dark person and you're seeing that descent of his morals. Everything becomes questionable, the things that are going on, and the toxicity romance that goes on in this pulls you in, grips you, and doesn't let you go. And at the very end of the book, you're like, wait, no, I want more. What's going on? And I really like the synopsis of this book, so I'm going to read it out to you, and I'm not going to give you more details than that because I went into it based on this synopsis and it was so well done that by the end of it I was completely shook. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. But we have when Paul enters university in the early 1970s Pittsburgh. We have our academic setting. Is with the hope of moving past the recent death of his father. Sensitive, insecure, and incomprehensible to his grieving family, Paul feels isolated and alone. So when he meets the worldly Julian, Paul is immediately drawn into his classmate's effortless charisma. Paul sees Julian as his sole intellectual equal, an ally against a suffocating conventional world. Paul will stop at nothing to prove himself worthy of their friendship, because with Julian life is more invigorating than Paul could ever have imagined. But as charismatic as he can choose to be, Julian is also volatile and capriciously cruel, and Paul becomes increasingly afraid that he will never live up to what Julian expects of him. As their friendship spirals into an all-consuming intimacy, they each learn the lengths to which they will go to stay together, an obsession that hurtles them towards an act of irrevocable violence. Unfolding with a propulsive ferocity, These Violent Delights is an exquisitely plotted excavation of the depths of human desire and the darkness it can bring forth in us. So I feel like it's got a lot of the aesthetic elements of dark academia with the academic setting and the darker side to things, but I do think with the obsession that they have, it does fit in the core, but maybe just on the cusp between the core of dark academia books and aesthetic dark academia books. But this is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, would highly recommend. Do check your trigger warnings because, like I say, it's a very, very toxic romance, but it is so well done. I loved it, and to be honest, I think this kind of wins for my favourite book out of all of these. Although If We Were Villains is very much up there as well, but this was just decadent in a way that I couldn't stop reading. It was fantastic and definitely deserves a reread. That's the thing, like, these dark academia books are some of my favourite books and I want to reread all of them. But let's move on to the aesthetic, which is more what you see from the Pinterest side of things. So when I showed you that collection of different images that I found on Pinterest, this is what I mean by the aesthetic. It's this aesthetic that is the setting inside books, which then gives people to say that they are dark academia. And while they may not have the core elements of murder or obsession of a particular subject or the morally grey unreliable narrator, they may have one or two of those elements but set in the academic setting with the aesthetic of it. So it will be students that dress that way, you've got the darker libraries and things like this. I'm just very pernickety in what I class as dark academia. Like, they are thriller books but with so much more to them, and this is just the aesthetic of taking place in a school and maybe not much more. Some of them have more, some of them don't, but it's an interesting time. Okay, so a classic book that gets referenced a lot as dark academia, but I feel like is more just like the aesthetics of dark academia really, is actually The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And I can understand why, especially in the normal version, so this is the uncensored version, but in the normal version, actually and a bit in this, we have Dorian Gray that gets manipulated by this person to become this very vain and vapid person. He was very innocent beforehand and was kind of used and manipulated, and we're being manipulated by someone that's doing it just for the chaos, and even admits that. So Dorian Gray becomes enamored with this, ends up making this deal that he can then stay young forever. His portrait then doesn't stay young forever. In this book is when I started picking up on elements that I think where people get the dark academia idea from, and that is because he gets obsessed with this book, but we're never told what it is. So I feel like, yes, there's elements of that obsession, but it's not a true dark academia book to me, so I'm going to put it in this kind of aesthetic. It could also go into the dark academia adjacent. I feel maybe that's a better style for it. Let's talk about dark academia adjacent then, because this I feel is dark academia adjacent more than aesthetic. So dark academia adjacent for me is books that have elements of dark academia, but we're not seeing it from the main character that is involved within that. So for this, the perspective of this is, we'll kind of get different perspectives, but mainly from an artist who loves Dorian and then sees this descent from someone that was really innocent and pure to someone that is very much not and very morally questionable, and it goes down from there, and you see from an outside perspective how he's become obsessed and manipulated by this particular person, and also talking about this book but refusing to actually show what it is, being very shrouded in mystery, very obsessed with it, not wanting to part with it. And I feel like those are elements that could be dark academia, but more adjacent because we're not seeing the actual obsession of the character from their lens. So a good book to describe that is actually Summer Suns, and this is by Lee Mandello. So I picked this one up thinking it was going to be dark academia because that's where I got the recommendation from. However, it's more dark academia adjacent. So in a similar way to Dorian Gray, we're following a perspective of somebody that isn't the one that becomes obsessed with the particular topic. Instead, it was his best friend who passed away, and he is determined to find out what happened to his best friend. He is determined to unravel this mystery that no one's really looking into. And so he travels to the university that his friend went to, finds out that his friend became so enamored with this particular topic that it drove him to this series of investigations that ultimately led to his death. And we're seeing it from this outside perspective that's very much like, why would you get tangled up in this? Why would you become obsessed over this subject? But we're also seeing the other side because, you know, that his investigating his death is not the only thing he's doing. He also likes fast cars and drugs, so you're seeing that side of things. So I feel like Dark Academia adjacent, we have the academic setting, we do have the obsession with a subject that then leads down a darker path, but it's not from our main character's perspective. We're seeing main character's perspective realise that's what happened to his friend, and he's trying to uncover those secrets. So there is elements of the dark academia, which is why I feel like it's dark academia adjacent, just like A Picture of Dorian Gray. Highly recommend this one though, although it is kind of like a Fast and Furious dark academia version. Interesting mix up, but I really enjoyed it, and I liked the look at not just academic side of like the dark academic side of things of obsession and stuff, but also a general academic look at how academia is kind of a privilege and seeing how class and race comes into that. And I think that was discussed really well in this book. And then of course we have the other side of things where it's a bit more like fast cars and partying and stuff. Maybe I'm too manicky with all my little like subcategories to dark academia, and maybe I overthink it all, but it's what makes sense in my mind. Another book that I feel is dark academia adjacent is actually Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This book gets said so often for being dark academia, and yes, but no. Because again, we're not seeing it from the perspective of somebody that is obsessed with the subjects that are going on. We're following our main character. She gets enrolled into this university because she can see ghosts, and she is then part of this underground society, and her role is to oversee the different sections of this society, making sure that their experiments that they do don't get out of hand. If we were looking at somebody that was a part of one of those factions that have the obsession with a particular subject, that then do these experiments which cross lines of what is morally right and wrong and cross borders of like what's paranormal and stuff, dark academia. but because we're seeing this from an outsider's perspective, who's very much like, I don't get what your obsession is over this is all ridiculous, you're meddling in things that you shouldn't, is dark academia adjacent. And it does end up with murders and things happening because these experiments get out of control and the people doing them don't really know what they're doing. They're just people that are messing around with something that they've become obsessed with, entrenched in, but don't actually understand the real life consequences of all of this. And it is a great book, like I do love it, but again, I think it classes as dark academia adjacent because it's not our main character that's telling us the story of how they became entrenched in this and became obsessed with it. They're telling us the story of how they got tangled up in all of this and it's ridiculous and they're not actually a part of it, are sort of. So I don't know if I did a good job of explaining that. Again, we have the school setting, so it's aesthetically dark academia as well, but I do think it's more adjacent just because of the perspective we're seeing it from. And I think that's what I mean by dark academia adjacent, is the perspective isn't from the person that's our unreliable narrator. Instead, it's from someone that is outside looking in and seeing what's happening that way. But back to aesthetic dark academia books, there is quite a few. Some of them I haven't read because I know they're just going to be aesthetically dark academia, and so I'm not as interested in them. But a couple that I have read that I would class as that. We have For Your Own Good, and this is by Samantha Downing. I did really enjoy this book. We're looking from a teacher who is very much obsessed with what is right, what is wrong, and teaching his students lessons, but not just his students, his fellow co-workers as well. And we know he is in the wrong from the very beginning. We see his unreliable narrator perspective, so we've got that. We have the school setting, we have murder involved, but it's not really a true obsession over a particular subject, it's an obsession over manners. It has all the elements there, but it's not quite in the core section, so it's more aesthetically leaning rather than anything else. Did really enjoy this book. I thought it was very fascinating, really interesting. I did annotate and tab and I had a good time with it and would recommend. An interesting one because it also shows the cyclical nature of things. It ends in a way where you could definitely see this all happening all over again, and I do enjoy books like that, but I don't think it's quite fully in the core section of dark academia, but it has all the other elements to it, so I would say it's more aesthetic. And then the other book that I would say is more aesthetically dark academia leaning is Madam by Phoebe Wynne. Perfect atmosphere, perfect setting, the aesthetics are there 100%. We have the darker school setting. Honestly, it's a really creepy, eerie atmosphere that goes on. It's not a small group of students that get together that become obsessed over a subject that then do questionable things. It's not that. Instead, we're seeing a teacher that goes to this school and realizes that things aren't as they seem, and the school is not there to actually educate these girls. Instead, it's there for a very different reason. It's so wrong and she feels so uncomfortable with this, and so she sets about trying to bring the school down, but is also very worried about doing this because they have access to her mum who is very ill. It's a difficult situation that she's in. So it's a thriller. It has all the aesthetics of it, but it doesn't have the obsession. And yes, we leak down some morally questionable decisions, but not that far, and we don't really have an unreliable narrator as such, so I don't think it fits in the core at all. But the aesthetics of this book are perfect and do fit in that subcategory as a result of dark academia. I really enjoyed this book. It's kind of, I always talk about it as, if you've seen the Julia Roberts film Mona Lisa's Smile, it's kind of a darker version of that, but make it an English teacher and not an art teacher. Very compelling, very well done, and like I say, the setting, so good. And that's what makes it a dark academia book. Had a great time annotating this one though. It was really good fun. And now the weird dark academia books, which is my favourite probably, and I only have 4 books to talk about in this category. 3 I have physically, 1 I read as an ebook. And if you know me by now, you should know the 3. So of course, one of these is Bunny by Mona Awad, and Bunny is seen as a dark academia book, but is a satirical take on dark academia. The core elements, we have this exclusive school, we have this group of students within this exclusive school that becomes a little bit obsessed over something that they shouldn't become. We have our unreliable narrator who gets caught up in said group, who then goes down this path of obsession and morally questionable decisions. We also have murder in a way. So all the core elements of it, but it's a satirical take on it, and it is weird as hell and you don't know what is going on half the time. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I love what Mona Auer did with the dark academia genre and twisted it and showed us all the elements, the core elements that this book does have, but made it so weird and made it kind of satirical is the word for it. It's just done so well. So the first time I read this book, I DNF'd it. I couldn't get past it. I thought it was so weird. I was like, what the hell am I reading? Then I reread the first part of the book that I'd DNF and continued on, and it was a buddy read with my friend at work, and I loved it. I thought it was really weird, really unusual, and by the end of this book I was like, wow, that was fantastic. And now I'm kind of in the middle of my third read. I mean, I say that, I'm only 20 pages in, and I am now annotating so much more than the second time I read this book. So I did annotate little things here and there, but now I'm going in annotating so much more. There are so many different things that I am looking at, so many things that I am picking up from the very start of this book. This is probably going to be one of my most annotated books. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. The way Mona Auer just took apart the dark academia genre made it so weird and so compelling, and it was so well done. I really think it was fantastic. So yeah, so this is a weird dark academia book that also can count as a core dark academia book, but is so weird it needs its own category. Another one that's kind of like that is Vita Nostra, and this is by Marina and Sergei Daishenko. This is translated from Russian by Julia Hersey. These are Ukrainian authors that did this amazing dark academia book. It is actually a duology, I believe, although you can read it as a standalone. I am looking forward to getting the second book though. And this one we're following Sasha, and Sasha is approached by this gentleman one day that sets her off doing these different weird tasks, and every time she completes a task she coughs up a gold coin, and when she's got a certain amount of gold coins she then goes to this very elite school, and in this school they start learning things that kind of tear apart the fabric of reality. It is so weird and so unusual, although I would say that this book is more dark academia aesthetic rather than core like Bunny. So we have the weird academic setting, very dark, very different. We have the obsession over a subject, the romanticizing of education, and the romanticizing of not having a life outside of the subject that you are studying. But it becomes so weird. It is so unusual. Everything unravels. Reality itself unravels the further you get into this, and so it's so weird. It has all the aesthetics and characteristics of dark academia. It doesn't have everything to make it a core one, but it is so weird and so unusual that it fits perfectly. Another book that's very similar to Vita Nostra is Catherine House. Now Catherine House I read for Jan Agton's book club. It was weird. It is very similar in a sense to Vita Nostra, but I don't think it's as good as Vita Nostra. So again, we're following main character who gets invited to this elite school that she wouldn't have been able to get into otherwise, and it's a school that is obsessed with this element. It's not protons, it's something scientific. It's something that they become obsessed with, that they've created, and going into this school everyone comes out being very wealthy, very elitist, like they end up as like actors or prime ministers or things like this. Getting into this school is seen as a privilege, but once you're in this school you realise things aren't quite right. Ending does kind of leave it, in my opinion, a bit open-ended as to what is going on, and I really like that. I think the elements of this shows, I don't want to get into spoilers and stuff, but there are elements of this that is so weird and so unusual, and again I think it is more aesthetically leaning. So we have the school, the academia school, we have the obsession around a subject, but I suppose this one could also be adjacent because our main character doesn't get obsessed with the subject, but she is seen get obsessed with this subject and the things that it causes in people. So I suppose you could do more adjacent and aesthetic leaning. There is also murder sort of in this book again, so it is a really unusual one, a really difficult one to talk about without giving away spoilers, but it's safe to say it's a very elite, closed off school. You have no contact with the outside world. At the end of the 3 years though, you get to go out with so much prestige and stuff that you're really going to make it in life, but is that really the case? And then the last dark academia weird book that I've read is the Rabbitback Literature Society, and this is by Pasi Jaskilenia. sorry, I really struggled to pronounce this surname, I'm so sorry. But this is a Finnish book, and this one was translated by Lola M. Rogers, and I really enjoyed this one. Again, I would say maybe more aesthetics than anything else. We have this literature society. We're all done together as students. They became under the wing of this prestigious author, and she had this little club that was the Rabbitbat Literature Society, and to be a part of this club was to be very exclusive, and you knew that you were going to become an amazing published author as a result of being in this club. And then we're seeing them as adults, and you have moments where they're looking back on their past selves, and then you're realizing that this club is very unusual. There are certain games that they do, which again, morally questionable decisions. There isn't any murder, sort of. Again, it's a questionable one. It could be murder, it could not be. It kind of leaves it open to you. We also have a bit of a disappearance that's happening. It is very weird, very unusual. You're left kind of thinking like there is a possibility for it being a very logical answer, and there's a possibility for it being a very folklorish based answer as to what is going on. But you have the core elements of people becoming obsessed with being a part of this society. We have our main character who gets approached to become their 10th member of this society, and you see the descent, and from there I think it fits perfectly in this weird dark academia category that I have, where it really questions reality, and that's what I enjoy about this category in particular, is the way it does question things. And then I thought I'd just talk about a couple of books that aren't seen as dark academia but do have elements of dark academia, and I think it'd be really interesting to see like why would you think that they don't get seen as dark academia after seeing all these different books and the way that they all have some elements of dark academia in them, why then these ones that have some aren't seen as it. So one of those books is actually Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is a book where we're following two main characters who become obsessed with creating EOs, and EOs are extraordinary people, think X-Men, and they become obsessed with that. They're in a university, so we have that setting. We have our narrators, they're both unreliable, so we have that. We have the obsession with this subject, so again we have that. And then we have the descent into morally questionable decisions and resulting in murder. So we have all of those elements to it, but it is not ever really on any dark academia lists that I find. But it has a lot of the elements to it. So it'd be really interesting to see why you don't think this one is a part of it, even though it has a lot of those elements. I would say it's because it's more of a fantasy book, but then Ninth House is more fantasy as well, and that's still seen as dark academia. Be interesting. And also a couple of classic books as well that have this is The Island of Dr. Moreau. Again, we have this person that becomes obsessed with a particular subject, and although it's not in a school setting, he is instead banished from English society and English universities because of his experiments and his obsession with this subject that he won't stop, and it leads him down this very dark path. But it could be argued it's more dark academia adjacent because we're not seeing it from the perspective of this person who becomes obsessed with the subject and the experiments that leads them down all the questionable decisions. Instead, we're seeing it from a perspective of somebody who gets washed up on his island and sees the resulting effect of all of this. So dark academia adjacent, but again, it's not really a book that is kind of put with dark academia, so I find it really interesting. But I thought I would wrap up with a few dark academia books that I actually have on my TBR, so if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned them, well, I haven't actually read them yet, and whether I think they're going to be cool or more aesthetically leaning. So one we have is The Things We Do to Our Friends. This is by Heather Darwin. Again, I think this is going to be more aesthetically leaning. I feel like there is potential for it to be a core dark academia book, but it's going to be based on whether we actually have the obsession around a subject. So we are following a character who attends, I think it's Edinburgh University? Yes. And she has a secret, and she's trying to hide it, and then she gets tangled up in this group of girls, and they then get her to do some questionable things. I think it's going to be a really good book and a really good fun time. I have high hopes. You'll have to let me know if you've read it. We also have The Promise Boys by Nick Brooks, and I found this on a Waterstones table actually that said it was dark academia leaning. Again, we have an urban prep school, so we have the tick for that. We are following students JB, Ramon and Trey, They are forced to follow the prestigious program's strict rules. Extreme discipline, they've told, is what it takes to be college bound to avoid the fates of many men in their neighbourhood. The principal ends up murdered. These three boys are having to maintain their innocence and track down the real killer. So I feel like, again, this is going to be more aesthetic than anything else. I don't think we're going to have the obsession with a particular subject. I'm still intrigued, but I think it's more YA thriller with just an academic setting, and that's why it's being called dark academia, which is kind of why I don't always look at dark academia recommendations anymore, because a lot of them seem to be more thriller based books, which is what dark academia books are. At the end of the day, they are thriller books. Just because they take place in a school doesn't mean that it's dark academia. But that's what I think is going to happen with this one. We also have Olivia Blake's The Atlas 6. This is one I keep putting off. This is one that I feel like could actually sit more in the core of dark academia though, because we have this group of 6 people that are very obsessed with becoming a part of the Alexandrian society. There's a lot of fighting between them because there's only 5 spots, so it makes them do questionable decisions. The obsession with getting into this society is going to lead them down a darker path, so I feel like that could be a very much dark academia book, a core one aesthetically. I don't know if we're going to have the unreliable narrator, I'm not sure about that, but I think it's definitely going to be more on the cusp of an actual core dark academia book than some of these other ones that I think is definitely just more aesthetic rather than anything else. Very intrigued by this one. I do need to read it soon. I keep putting it off and I don't know why. You'll have to actually like tell me out of these TBR ones which one I should prioritise. I think it's going to be really good and I'm really intrigued to see how it's going to be done, and I haven't read an Olivia Blake book yet. And then the last two we have The Cloisters by Cathy Hayes, and this one is an art gallery based book which I'm very excited about, and we have the obsession over tarot cards, and I think it's going to lead down a darker path. So again, I think this one has the potential to be a core academia book, but whether it ends up being one or whether it's just more aesthetically leaning, I don't know. I have heard some mixed reviews about this book. It has some gorgeous edges though. I have high hopes. I really hope that this is going to end up being a core dark academia book that I can really sink my teeth into. I'm not sure about an unreliable narrator. I'm not sure about murders. Does it have any murders in here? No, but we do have a game that spirals out of control. Museum's curator is the one that's obsessed with tarot and the possibility of divination, and our main character Anne really wants to like win approval from her colleagues, and so she's happy to indulge some of their more outlandish theories, but then she discovers a mysterious once believed lost deck of 15th century Italian tarot cards and finds herself at the center of a dangerous game of toxic friendship and unbridled ambition. So it could be more dark academia adjacent then. We'll see how it's going to go. I'm very interested in it. And then the final one I picked up recently is Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. Again, I don't know if this is just going to be more aesthetically leaning. I feel like it could end up with something being like These Violent Delights and have that obsession in here. We're following a main character who ends okay, so we have an elite boarding school, and then we have a young Australian woman who arrives to take up the antiquated role of matron. She finds herself really unsure of her role. The girls that she's in charge of are kind of ruthless, but then she meets Mrs. S, the headmaster's wife, becomes obsessed, an illicit affair arrives. I'm not actually sure, but I have heard it is dark academia. I've seen it on some dark academia videos. Again, I'm not sure if it's just going to be the aesthetics or what. We'll see. I have high hopes for it though. I think it's beautiful. Gorgeous cover. We'll see how it ends up going. But there we are. Those are all the dark academia books that I have read, the categories within dark academia books that I have put them in. Maybe this is too convoluted and the way I have subcategorized a subgenre is a bit much, but I hope you found it useful anyway. We've given you an idea of what these books are actually about. You have to let me know what you thought of it. That is me done. So let me know if you've read any of these, if you want to read any of these, or if you have any dark academia books and what you would categorize them as using my subcategory system, and let me know all of that in the comments below. But I've been talking for ages, so it's definitely time to go. So thank you so much for watching. If you have made it this far, then let's put, there's a pen emoji or like a scroll, something like that, something academia leaning, in the comments below. So thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, please do give it that thumbs up, subscribe and comment. Those 3 things really help this channel grow. My social media links, anyone I've mentioned, will all be linked below, and I will will of course catch you in the very next video.